Lord, how long shall I cry for help, and you will not listen? Or cry to you violence, and you will not save? The opening lines of our reading from the book of Habakkuk are a lamentation to God, much in the tradition of the book of Psalms. That phrasing is similar to the Psalms, but the character of these lines is also consistent with the book of Job. Why do you make me see wrongdoing and look at trouble? Destruction and violence are before me, strife and contention arise. But how are we supposed to question God? How can we do that? How can we criticize what God is doing, or in this instance, what God is not doing? So the law becomes slack and justice never prevails. The wicked surround the righteous, therefore judgment comes forth perverted. This cannot be what God intended. The law is not being followed, and the world has fallen into injustice. How can that be? Of course, this observation relies upon the assumption that the law being followed would eventually lead to justice. In this passage, law can also mean the teachings, what is taught in the Bible and historically treated as law, for Torah means law. I will stand at my watchpost and station myself at the rampart. I will keep watch to see what he will say to me and what he will answer concerning my complaint. I'm calling out to God, and then I'm going to wait for an answer. This again is the pattern set forth in the book of Job, a man suffering and demanding that God explain what exactly is happening. Of course, in the book of Job, God confronts Job and then demands of Job who he thinks he is for questioning God. In the book of Habakkuk, we hear a different response. Then the Lord answered me and said, "Write the vision, make it plain on tablets so that a runner may read it." Make it easy to see, make it easy to read, like on a billboard, that you can get the message even if you're running on by. For this is what I plan to do. For there is still a vision for the appointed time. It speaks of the end and does not lie. If it seems to tarry, wait for it. It will surely come, it will not delay. Just wait. Wait, and the answer will come. God will respond to these injustices, to this lawlessness, to all of the problems the people are facing. Just wait. But of course, the time frame of God is not the time frame of human beings. As the saying goes, the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends towards justice. That does not mean that any of us are going to live to see that day. Well, let's consider such a momentous day. It could be called a day of reckoning, a day of vindication, even perhaps a day of justice. What you call it depends entirely upon how you feel about the event. One such day was May 14, 1948. And on that day, a new country came into being, a new Jewish state, Eretz Israel, the land of Israel, or more formally, the state of Israel. That was the day of the Declaration of Independence of Israel. And like the United States, such a declaration was the beginning of a nation and the start of a war. The Second World War had ended in 1945. The subsequent 3 years were difficult for many of the people in Europe. Refugees were scattered across the continent and in some cases across the globe. Some were just trying to get home, but some had no homes to return to. And that was particularly true for Jewish Europeans. A new barrier was being drawn, the so-called Iron Curtain. The term comes from literal iron curtains that were used in theaters to try and help prevent the spread of fire. Winston Churchill borrowed that term in a letter to President Harry Truman, describing an iron curtain being drawn across the Soviet-Russian front, behind which they did not know what was happening. Now, many Jewish refugees could not return to their homelands because of the destruction, but also because they were facing anti-Semitism in many of those areas. There was nothing waiting for these poor people other than ruined cities and ancient hatred. But that did not mean that anyone else was eager to let them resettle. For example, the United States had a strict quota system against allowing refugees into the country, and that would not be relaxed until 1953. After the war, fewer than 5% of Americans polled wanted to increase the number of war refugees allowed into the United States. About a third wanted to reduce the number even further. And Jewish refugees were prevented from emigrating in part because they were coming in from areas behind the Iron Curtain, and so they were suspected of being communist sympathizers. And it's worth noting that during the war, emigration was prevented because they were thought to be Nazi sympathizers, as absurd as that sounds today. But the US was not alone. The United Kingdom was seeking to prohibit emigration by Jews into what was then known as the Mandatory Palestine. Mandatory comes from the word mandate, and the British had control of the region under an international mandate set up by the League of Nations since the First World War. Palestine had previously been controlled by the Ottoman Empire, and the majority of the area's residents were Muslim. In 1920, for example, the area's population was around 700,000, only 11% of which were Jewish. And these were mostly Orthodox Jews, and many of them were not terribly interested in the establishment of a new Jewish homeland, which may sound odd. Why did they not want to rebuild the kingdom of Israel? Because many of them believed that God would be the one to reestablish Israel. It would not be human beings. For there is still a vision for the appointed time. It speaks of the end and does not lie. If it seems to tarry, wait for it. It will surely come, it will not delay. But this had been a very long delay. For some of the people of Judaism, it was too long. In the late 19th century, some European Jews were terribly tired of waiting. They had been suffering under the anti-Semitism of Central and Eastern Europe, and they had come to the conclusion that Jews in the diaspora would never be truly free. These were the Zionists, and they wanted to change the plight of the world's Jewish population. The Roman Empire had driven out most of the people of Israel from their lands, and they renamed the area Palestine, which roughly translates to the land of the Philistines. The Jews had fought 3 wars against the Romans as occupiers, and it was decided by the Romans that there would be no more of that. And the diaspora was the wide dispersion of Jews across Asia, Africa, and Europe, splintering the once common people into far-flung geographic groups with only their common religion and traditions to keep them together. However, antagonism between Christianity and Judaism made it difficult for Jews to find any place in Europe to call home. In 1492, for example, all Jews were ordered to leave the Kingdom of Spain. They could leave with whatever they could carry, provided they weren't carrying silver, gold, or currency. England, France, and Germany had already expelled their Jewish populations by this point in history. The largest number of European Jews could then be found in Russia. But then in late 19th century, there were waves of pogroms and riots against these Jews. And one response to that violence was Zionism, a new philosophy of self-determination for the Jews of the world, and in particular, a desire to establish a Jewish homeland in Palestine. This was not, however, a desirable result for the Ottoman Empire, which controlled Palestine at the time. But the later British mandate holders were less hostile to the idea, perhaps because they wanted someone there to protect their interests in Egypt, particularly in the Suez Canal. The League of Nations gave a mandate of control to the British in the hope of establishing some national home for the Jewish people. After the Second World War, the newly formed United Nations was planning on partitioning Palestine, giving the western and southern portions for a Jewish state, and the rest of it would go to the Palestinians. This Jewish state notably would not have included Jerusalem, which was to become an international city under the control of the UN. And no one was entirely happy with the plan or with that detail in particular. The Palestinians and the neighboring Arab countries were particularly upset. Conflict filled the region beginning in 1947, mostly guerrilla and terrorist activity going back and forth. Now, whether one is a guerrilla or a terrorist depends upon who's telling the story, which is the nature of history. Well, the Declaration of Independence coincided with the British withdrawing their forces and presence from Palestine. And immediately afterwards, Egypt, Jordan, and Syria invade. And in what must seem the least likely result, the heavily outnumbered Israeli forces succeeded in defending this new nation. One might even think for a moment that God had finally delivered on the promise offered by the prophet Habakkuk. And yet, it was more of a mess than a miracle, at least in my personal assessment. The Arab armies all had competing agendas, wanting to carve up Palestine in differing and personally beneficial ways. Lebanon refused to join the war, in part, it is said, because the Israelis bribed them to stay out of the conflict. Who knows? The Israelis also relied upon air power to scatter invading armies, which was a technological form of deliverance. During a truce, Israel managed to import a large number of Czechoslovakian weapons through an embargo. And significantly, the United Nations at various moments stepped in to impose truces, which in hindsight seemed to benefit and give time to the Israelis to regroup. So how do all of these events change history? Well, prior to the declaration of the State of Israel in 1948, the Jews of Europe were a problem for the world. A problem in need of a solution, but no one could agree upon what to do. No one wanted to let these people in, to give them any place that they could call home. And as a problem, the Jews of Europe needed to be fixed, solved, saved. But nowhere in those discussions were the Jews of Europe ever considered to be the answer. And yet the people of this new Israel decided that they needed to become their own solution. Now, I should point out at this point in the discussion that what the Israelis did was in one way or another illegal in 1948. They broke treaties, they broke international law, they took land and possessions that did not belong to them. They also killed people. And as I mentioned, many of the longer-term residents, Jewish residents of Palestine, did not agree with this original effort to create a state of Israel. It was inconsistent with their understanding of the law, meaning the Torah, meaning their expectations of God and God's ancient promises. So the law becomes slack, and justice never prevails. The wicked surround the righteous, therefore judgment comes forth perverted. Was this new Israel what the prophet Habakkuk, what he had promised? Probably not. There are any number of moments in history you can turn to and point to in great broadness that this is a fulfillment of that prophecy. The belief that God would deliver the faithful from injustice is a common theme in the Bible. But what exactly did that sort of promise mean during the Second World War or during the Holocaust? Lord, how long shall I cry for help and you will not listen, or cry to you violence and you will not save? Well, while researching this sermon, I came across an article about the traditions of land ownership and land use in the ancient Near East, in places like Babylon, Egypt, and ancient Israel. And you will be pleased to know that I will be sharing next to nothing of that information with you. If you would like to know more about Mesopotamian ownership structures, let me know. But I will say that all of these ancient cultures understood what it meant to own land. Medieval Europe is actually far less recognizable to modern sensibilities about land ownership, with the king or the prince holding the land and then doling it out to the vassals and their servants. In ancient Israel, you owned the land. Sometimes it was a family group or a clan that held it all together, but the system is in some ways not very different from now. Thou shalt not steal is a fairly clear message under this system. It meant don't take stuff that doesn't belong to you. And yet the Romans come along and they kick out the Judeans. The Assyrians, the Babylonians, the Greeks All of them took land, possessions, and freedom at various points in history. Some stronger group comes in onto the scene and takes over. Some were better overlords than others. The Persians were seemingly on the better side, the European Crusaders, not so much. In 1948, the Zionists decided that they were going to create a new nation, the State of Israel. The choice to do that, again, broke numerous laws and treaties, conventions, and traditions. It was a plan to impose a claim on the land of Palestine from nearly 2,000 years before. And they would ignore centuries of ownership by Palestinian Arabs, who were also imperial subjects under the control of others across many of those centuries. It was and it is terribly unfair to the Palestinians, who had not done anything to create the Judean situation from 2,000 years ago. One would say that there was nothing fair about what happened. So what do we do? Who are we to do anything? Such a declaration of unfairness could easily be ascribed to the history of the Western Hemisphere. Our church is built on land of the Massachusetts tribe, indigenous people who over the centuries went extinct through the spread of European diseases, the violence of King Philip's War, and the expansionist efforts of American colonists. And I have a suspicion that there's not a lot going to be done about that. But here's a question. What if a remnant of the Massachusetts tribe somehow came back now, maybe even centuries in the future, and they somehow managed to take control of their old lands? They just drive us all into New York. Well, that act of hypothetical violence would be a crime. The seizure of land would be illegal under our current system of ownership. And it would be very similar to both the establishment of the State of Israel and the establishment of the Massachusetts Bay Colony, or the United States itself. You might even remember from the Bible that the promised land was taken from the Canaanites. Later, the Philistines muscle in and they take over some real estate, probably because they had been driven out of their homeland someplace off in the Greek islands. Who controls land in the Bible is often a question of force, with rulership changing hands across the centuries. In our current historical moment, parts of the nation of the Ukraine are being annexed by Russia this past week. The Crimean Peninsula was seized back in 2014. Both of these land grabs were illegal, and yet they happened. The war in Ukraine might still be settled by giving Russia some of that stolen land. And that's not right, and that's not fair, but it may be an expedient solution, one made at the expense of those who lived on and owned that land for many, many years. May 14, 1948 is an important day because it was the day when the people of Israel decided that they were going to take control of their own fate. However, they did so at the expense of someone else, the Palestinian people. It is not an auspicious day for the Palestinians, who refer to it as the Nakba, the disaster. What would we call it if something like that happened to us? In our reading, the people cry out to God seeking justice, wondering when the law would finally be heard and followed. That concern remains to this day, even as people after people, country after country, turn to force to make their will known in this world. This has not changed since the time of Habakkuk or the time of Jesus. It hasn't changed since the formation of the Massachusetts colony or the founding of the United States. It has not changed since Israel became a nation or since Russia decided that it owned some or all of the Ukraine. Many of these conflicts create vast suffering. But that is usually not enough for other nations in the world to band together and try and stop it, honestly. It was therefore surprising when the United States and the European Union decided to help Ukraine resist Russia. It was against their better economic interests, their usual patterns of behavior. But they did. They helped. They continue to help. And what does that cooperation mean for the foreseeable future? There are other places around the world where someone with power is looking hungrily across a border. There are disputes between old enemies that have not been adequately resolved. This will not be the last time our country is called upon to respond to aggressive action somewhere in the world. And how should we react to that, if at all? If I had a simple or easy answer, I would be king of the world. Sadly, no one has called to offer me the position. But I think we can at least look to the values that we hold dear, the lessons that we have been taught from ancient times. When the Jews of Europe banded together to protect themselves, it was a desperate response to centuries of prejudice and the existential threat of genocidal anti-Semitism during the Second World War. Conversely, the Palestinians can claim true harm to themselves, even as they, on occasion, turn to violence and target the innocent, depending on where we are in the conflict. Not every choice each side has made was or is legal or ethical, which is easy to say sitting on one side of an ocean many, many miles away, surrounded by the strongest military in world history. I think the best way of understanding what needs to be done is described by the concept of punching down. Punching down. It is never okay to punch down, meaning a strong person taking advantage of a vulnerable person. The popular kid lording over the outcasts, the bully targeting the weak. When the Israelis and the Palestinians first fought, it was two weak opponents fighting with larger countries trying to manipulate the outcome. Well, that dynamic has changed. When the state of Israel responds to the actions of the Palestinians, it can now sometimes seem like they are punching down, striking at someone who is less powerful. And that is not fair, even if the existence of Israel and the safety of its people remain very important. When Russia attacked the Ukraine, they were punching down. If China were to attack Taiwan, they would be punching down. There will always be someone more powerful trying to take advantage of someone less powerful. The prophets often called upon the powerful to help the poor, to take care of those in need. And the same is true in our current moment. We and our friendly countries, our allies, together are more powerful than these belligerent parties. And the good and right thing to do is to get ready, to speak up, to act when we see someone punching down. That is true for the United States, it's true for the nations of the world, and it's true for us in our own lives. We have been taught by Jesus that the meek shall inherit the earth. But in many ways, the inheritance is ours to guard on behalf of those less powerful. Because the meek cannot do it by themselves, they cannot do it alone. They need others with power to ensure that the world is more like that imagined by Jesus than by those willing to use force and coercion to get their way. Someone needs to stop others from punching down. And so, may the power we possess in this life be used to protect and to serve. May we be reminded to serve the good rather than simply serving ourselves. And may we be peacemakers both in words and in deeds. Amen.